Matthew chapter 11, verse 25. At that time, Jesus said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and intelligent and revealed them to infants. Yes, Father, because this was your good pleasure. All things have been entrusted to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son desires to reveal him. Come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take up my yoke and learn from me, because I am lowly and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. At that time, Jesus passed through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick and eat some heads of grain. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, See, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. He said to them, Haven't you read what David did when he and those who were with him were hungry, how he entered the house of God and they ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for him or for those with him to eat, but only for the priests? Or haven't you read in the law that on Sabbath days the priests in the temple violate the Sabbath and are innocent? I tell you that something greater than a temple is here. If you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Moving on from there, he entered their synagogue, and there he saw a man who had shriveled hand, and in order to accuse him, they asked him, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? He replied to them, Who among you, if he had a sheep that fell into a pit on the Sabbath, wouldn't take hold of it and lift it out? A person is worth far more than a sheep, so it is lawful to do what is good on the Sabbath. Then he told the man, Stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out, and it was restored, as good as the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted against him, how they might kill him.
Right, let's turn to God's Word. We're going to be focusing on verses 1 through to 14 of Matthew 12. This is picking up the next stage in my series with you on Matthew's Gospel. And as you can see, the title is What a Day. I mean, what a day. It starts with Jesus and his disciples walking, snacking on blackberries. That's my cultural translation for picking a few grains of corn, because, you know, dry muesli, who wants that as you're walking along in the field? That's the kind of equivalent, isn't it? So, yeah, my cultural translation is snacking on blackberries as they're walking along. So it starts with that and it ends with a plot, the first we read of in Matthew's Gospel, to kill Jesus. I mean, that went south quickly, didn't it? It seemed a pleasant day. It was all nice. But it really went badly very, very quickly. There had been harsh words before. Jesus even had warned his disciples that there'd come a day when people would plot their death. But suddenly this is all happening. And what was the problem? Well, on the surface, it was all over the use of the Sabbath, the weekly day off within the Jewish Old Testament religion. And you might say, well, isn't that a big leap, talking about a day off to plotting to kill Jesus? Well, yes. And that's because the Sabbath wasn't the real issue in terms of why they were plotting to kill Jesus. It was his assertion in the middle of the conflict, as it comes in verse 8, that he said, for the Son of Man, that was his favorite phrase to refer to himself, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And every Jew knew that God had given the Sabbath to his people. It was God's Sabbath to give. He was Lord over it. So for Jesus to be saying, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, Jesus is making a very clear claim, and that is that he is God. And of course, that's the thread that will run through this gospel right to the conclusion. It will lead ultimately to the charge that was laid against Jesus at his trial. The high priest in Matthew 26 said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. Let's see what's happening as this day moves on. That missed my mouth. Sorry about that. Got a wet shirt for a while now. Okay, so, yes, what a day. The gift of a day off. I mean, didn't we all love it? That when King Charles was going to be crowned king, we got another bank holiday. I mean, that was the main thing to many of us, a day off, a free day off, an additional day off. It's absolutely wonderful. Nobody objects to a day off, do they? You know, a weekend, everybody looks forward to the weekend. Bank holiday, another day off. Holiday, great days off. It's lovely to have a day off. And that's the background to verse 1. This is the day off that we're talking about. At that time, Jesus passed through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick and eat some heads of grain. The background was that there was a weekly day off within the people of God, and it had started way back. It had started at creation. It had started with God actually taking a day off. In Genesis 1, we're given the account of God creating the world in his great creative activity over 6 days, and that he was loving it and delighting in it. And it came to the grand conclusion when God had made the first 2 people that God said, this is very good. This is very good, this creation that I have made. And then we read, beginning of Genesis 2, that on the 7th day, God had completed his work that he had done, and he rested. Now, from all that we know of God being almighty, all-powerful, that must raise some questions like, we rest. Why? Because we're tired. We're exhausted. We need to rest. What's going on here? Why does God need to rest? I mean, we know he's been busy. We know he's done an amazing job, but, is he getting a bit worn out with this or what? Is this rest of God for his benefit or for ours? So he rested on the 7th day from all his work he had done, and then God blessed the 7th day and declared it holy, set apart, sanctified, special. For on it he rested from all his work of creation. Now God then, in giving the 10 Commandments through Moses years later, devotes one of those commandments to giving us a day off. Good news, is it not? Have a day off. God says, 1 day in 7, have a day off. The commandment reads, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, set apart, sanctified, special. You are to labor 6 days and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath. It's a rest. To the Lord your God, you must not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female servant, your livestock, or the resident alien who is within your city gates. For the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and everything that is in them in 6 days. Then he rested on the 7th. Therefore, the Lord God blessed the Sabbath day and declared it holy. You notice what happens there? He gives a day off to all of his people. He says, you should have a day off, and all of those under your immediate influence and control, give them a day off as well. Don't get them working so that you can have a nice rest, but everybody rest together. And he gave a reason for that rest. What was the reason? The reason was his own rest. For the reason you should remember this Sabbath, the reason you should rest 1 day a week is For the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and everything in them, in 6 days. Then he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and declared it holy. So he sets himself forth as the pattern for his people. He says, basically, I rested to give you an example so that you too may be able to rest. One day every week. So this is good news. This is, yes, what a day. This is God with his almighty authority from heaven giving us a day off. It seems significant that Matthew has placed this just after those closing verses which we reread this morning at the end of Matthew 11. Come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. And later in verse 29, you will find rest for your souls. The rest of Jesus promised in those verses is much wider than this, but this day off, this weekly day off, is part of the rest that Jesus freely gives to us, that God freely gives to us. He is the one whose yoke is so easy and his burden is so light that he wants us to have a day off where we can stop working, where we can relax, where we can perhaps even, depending on the age of your children, put your feet up for a time. You can have a rest. Who would want to say no to that? Who would have wanted to say at the coronation of King Charles the III, isn't he? Yes, I think. No, don't want a day off. Most of us, sensible people, would say, thank you, that's great. I am going to enjoy that day off. And this is the rest that God has given us. Fantastic news. No reason to say no. Who would want to say no to that? But I wonder if you hear it that way this morning. Talking of Sabbath, talking of a day off, talking of God saying, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. I wonder whether you see it as a wonderful gift of a day off, or whether it sounds restrictive and oppressive, and like God is telling me I can't do this and I can't do that and I can't do the other. And if that is the case, I wonder if that has been influenced by the way you have either experienced firsthand or heard secondhand about certain things concerning the Sabbath or Sunday, and particularly in the Christian context. We can find hilarious, to be honest, examples in the Jewish context of the rules and regulations that they have around Sabbath, man-made inventions. The funniest I've ever heard is that there's a distance, a full distance, that you can't go further than that on the Sabbath. There's reference to it. It doesn't mean it's a biblical idea, but it was a well-known measure of a distance in the book of Acts in the New Testament. It's called a Sabbath day's journey, and that was the acceptable distance. I have exceeded that this morning in getting here. But in the Jewish thinking, in their man-made rules, they've said, well, that's different if you're at sea, because you can't just stop the boat, so yeah, it's different if you're at sea. So then they've said, well, actually, so if you have a water cushion in the car, you can keep going. It's just ridiculous, isn't it? And that kind of thinking just makes a mockery of the whole idea. It's playing with the rules and regulations. It's focusing on the rules and regulations rather than the gift of a day off. And you may have been brought up in a family or heard of other Christians who were brought up in families where, for instance, you couldn't play with a ball on a Sunday. Or you couldn't play a game, a board game even, on a Sunday, where maybe the only things that were allowed were church and reading, because they're the only sanctified things in the world, apparently. And you couldn't go to the park on a Sunday. You couldn't play with your friends as a kid on a Sunday, or perhaps even at the park swings, and this happened frequently. It happened every week, that frequently, in the Outer Hebrides of the Highlands of Scotland and parts of Northern Ireland. And that was the swings in the park would be padlocked together, so no one could swing on them because that would be defiling the Sabbath. Maybe that's the kind of thing that bothers you here. Someone told me recently of friends of his who, if he goes to stay with them over a weekend, on the Saturday night, all food, breakfast, lunch and dinner for Sunday, all drinks, every cup of tea, everything prepared beforehand, numerous flasks, flask tea, dreadful stuff. I don't know how they go with it. It's probably lukewarm by the time they're drinking it on Sunday evening. But they go to all these lengths because of a belief that to boil a kettle on a Sunday would be working. Now, if those kind of experiences are yours, or if those stories are things that you are familiar with, I'm not surprised if that's put you off this whole idea of there being a God-given day of rest. And I'm not surprised, not only because those things sound terrible, they sound nitpicking, they sound pernickety, they sound rule-bending and all focused on the rules and regulations rather than the heart of the good gift God has given to us. But I'm also not surprised because whenever, and I don't think that's an exaggeration, whenever God gives a good gift, the devil will make sure someone is around to ruin it and make that gift sound awful in some way or another. And one of the ways is to make it sound terribly restrictive, to make the gift of God sound terribly restrictive. So go back to the Garden of Eden and think of Adam and Eve there in Eden. They are told that they can have, in Genesis 2, all the trees in the garden, and you can freely eat of any of them. And then there's one tree, just one tree, that you can't eat of. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and that's the one you can't eat of. So, vast gifts, one restriction. The devil, in the form of a serpent, comes into the Garden of Eden and says to the woman, did God really say you can't eat from any tree in the garden? And so this restriction of one tree, this one tree you can't eat of, but actually you can eat the fruit from the rest of the trees. Satan has exaggerated into, is that what God said, that you can't eat from any tree in the garden? And Eve responds. What the serpent says about it in terms of Eve's response is, look, this is God being a killjoy. Because she'd said, well, you'll die if you eat of it. And the serpent says, no, you'll certainly not die. In fact, God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. Now that's the devil's way, to make God sound restrictive, a killjoy, one who ruins good things, who doesn't want us to have the best. You see, this is exactly what this passage revolves around. Picking and eating grain did not go against the idea of a day off. And that leads us to our second point. There we go. How a good gift can be abused. How a good gift can be abused. God had given a gift which was so precious that he had gift wrapped it in a commandment to say, I want to protect this. This is a beautiful day off I'm giving to you. It's set apart, it's special, it's holy, it's sanctified. So I'm going to gift wrap it in a commandment. And then the devil comes along to pollute it. And so often the devil does this subtly by taking our pride, which wants to show God just how good I am and how well I have kept your commandments. And we do this in all kinds of areas, but we're focusing on the day off question today. And we, in our pride, want to say, look, God, look how well I have kept the Sabbath. Look how well I have observed this day off that you have given me. And then tick, 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 I've done it. Now, the Jews were experts in this. The Pharisees broke down the Sabbath into 39 subcategories of things you couldn't do on the Sabbath. Can you believe that? I mean, God put it really succinctly in that fourth commandment. Take a day off. Here it is. Just you can have a day off, and those under your immediate influence, give them a day off as well. There it is. It's as simple as that. But no, let's have 39 subcategories that we can say these are the things we mustn't do, and 6 of them are relevant to this whole question of picking grain. They are ploughing, planting, reaping, harvesting, threshing, and winnowing. And you can understand at one level, because they're talking about serious agricultural work. They're like harvesting, and I'm sorry to admit it, but I've never done any harvesting. Why? Because it looks too much like hard work. Any farmer will tell you that harvesting is hard work. So yes, harvesting was not an activity for the day of rest. But to leap between harvesting and picking a few blackberries and eating them, well, there was slightly more, with the grain. Apparently they'd rub their hands together to get rid of the outer chaff, blow it away. And that was the equivalent of winnowing, they said, the Jews. So that was work, they said. This is ridiculous exaggeration that is actually going on. But this is what is going on. That is why they say, verse 2, when the Pharisees saw this, they said to Jesus, see, your disciples are doing what is not lawful. They believed it to be against the law of God to do this on the Sabbath. But what they were doing was in a completely different league, completely different order to harvesting. And the Pharisees ruined the gift. What was a lovely gift of a day off? They ruin it by replacing it with nitpicking legalism. So that's one way a good gift can be abused. It can be messed up with a load of nitpicking rules about what can and cannot be done. But then the other danger, the other way that a good gift can be abused is to say, I hate all that nitpicking, so I'm just going to forget about the gift. What was the point of that? If God has given you a gift, he's given it for a reason. And we know that the horrible nitpicking is horrible, but it's no reason to then forget about the gift, to have nothing to do with the gift, or to go to I can just live as if every day is the same. I hate the legalism of some people, so I'll do whatever I like. And whilst that's an understandable reaction, can I say it's an overreaction? It's an overreaction, and again you see it in the Garden of Eden. And you see it there because if the devil can convince us that God is a restrictive killjoy, he's just one small step away from leading you into sin, into disobedience. So again, back in Genesis 3, the serpent had come into the Garden of Eden and said to Eve, did God really say, you can eat from any tree in the garden? Verse 2, the woman said to the serpent, we may eat the fruit from the trees in the garden. But about the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden, God has said, and listen carefully to what she says, God has said, you must not eat it or touch it. What's she doing? She's adding a rule. God said nothing about touching it. He just said you can't eat it. But you see, the serpent has brought into her mind that God is a restrictive killjoy, and he's said, oh, you can't eat any fruit from any of the trees in the garden. She manages to hold off of that and say, no, that's not right. We can actually eat of any of the trees apart from one. And of that one, we can't eat it. And she's slipped into this next step. And we can't touch it. Well, that does sound restrictive, doesn't it? And she says, even if we touch it, we will die. So Eve has basically decided that God is a restrictive killjoy. That he won't even let them touch the fruit of that tree when God absolutely said nothing about touching it. And this principle works through. That if we reach the point of thinking that there's all kinds of rules and regulations that are really restrictive about a God-given day off, then we'll do what Eve did. You know, what did she do? She picked the fruit, ate it. She disregarded God's good, healthy guidelines that were for her best, for her good, for humanity's good. And God's good guidelines is that we should have a day off each week. But if we start getting wrapped up in the nitpicking regulations, and we start thinking God is a bit of a killjoy and doesn't like us doing this, doesn't like us having fun, doesn't like us doing that, then we're one step away from just saying, forget about this good gift altogether. So there are two ways of how a good gift can be abused. It can be abused by the nitpickers. It can be abused then by those who say, I just don't want anything to do with that, so I'll forget all about that day. Thirdly and finally, let's look at Jesus and the gift of Sabbath. Let's look at how Jesus responds. First of all, he shows from the Bible that God and the Bible, God's word, are not nitpicking. God is not a nitpicking legalist. So it says in verse 3, Jesus says to them, haven't you heard what David did when he and those who were with him were hungry, how he entered the house of God and they ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for him or for those with him to eat, but only for the priests? Or haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple violate the Sabbath and are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus goes to the Bible, showing that his response is absolutely a biblical response. Now, to explain better than I can what is going on, and more succinctly than I can, let me quote good preacher, scholar, theologian Don or D.A. Carson in his commentary on this passage. He says, on the one hand, David ate. On the other, it was unlawful for him to do so. The law said he was not to eat that bread. Jesus' point is not simply that rules admit of exceptions, but notice Carson is saying, there are rules that allow for exceptions, and we shouldn't expect them all to be written in the scriptures. That applies to the priests who work, that we will come on to in just a moment. That there was no specific laws that said, oh, and by the way, it's okay for priests to work, even though it's not for everybody else. But the fact that the priests were asked to work implied that, but there was no specific exception. So Jesus' point is not simply that rules admit of exceptions, but that the scriptures themselves do not condemn David for his action. Therefore, the rigidity of the Pharisees' interpretation that we're reading today of the law is not in accord with the scriptures itself. Notice that? God's word doesn't condemn David for eating the bread. It's allowed. It's driving at the heart of the command that matters, not getting nitpicking rules around it. There's an exception, a good exception, and the Bible, God does not condemn David. And Jesus is using this to say, look, eating a few blackberries out on a walk is absolutely fine. Always has been, always will be. And then he refers to this question about the priests. Are they working on the Sabbath when they offer sacrifices? And again, Carson says, formally speaking, the Levitical priests, inverted commas, broke the Sabbath every week, since the right worship of God in the temple required them to do some work, like changing the consecrated bread and offering the double burnt offering. In reality, of course, the priests were guiltless. The law that established the Sabbath also established the right, the duty of priests, formally speaking, to break it. And so Jesus is showing us that the Bible, God himself speaking, allows for these exceptions. He makes sure that we're not nitpicking about this great gift of a day off. He shows that we need to look at the heart, the aim, the intent of the law, and that we're not to expect every detail to be spelt out for us as to what we can and can't do. That's not the point. The heart of it is God gives us a day off, a day to refresh ourselves, a day to worship him, a day to encourage one another in the Lord. We are given that day off, not to expect every detail to be spelt out for us. And then Jesus stamps his authority on the Sabbath in those words in verse 8. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. He says, it's mine. I'll make the rules. And that is a huge claim, because everybody knew it was God's day to give. God had given the day off. So yes, it is a claim to deity here. He is showing himself to be God, the Son. And he says, look, it's mine. I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. It's mine. And I'll make the rules. And when Mark recounts this same event in Mark chapter 2, he adds that Jesus also said, and you know what? I made it for you. That the Sabbath is for man. It's a gift for our benefit. Then in verses 9 to 13, he stamps his authority on the Sabbath in deeds and in words with this event of the man who's in the synagogue. He goes into the synagogue. It's the Sabbath day. That's what all Jews did. And verse 10 there, he saw a man who had a shriveled hand, and in order to accuse him, they asked Jesus, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Here they are, you see, they're wanting to nitpick again. Is this okay? Trying to find him doing something that was against, in those 39 categories, this was something you shouldn't do because healing is work, they said. So he replied, look, he just uses common sense, common care, really. He says, who among you, if you had a sheep that fell into a pit on the Sabbath, wouldn't take hold of it and lift it out? You'd rescue your sheep, wouldn't you? A person is worth far more than a sheep. So it is lawful to do what is good on the Sabbath. And then he heals the man on the Sabbath. And that's enough. Verse 14. The Pharisees went out and plotted against him how they might kill him. His claim to deity is so clear, they plot to kill him. But Jesus, you see, was showing that kindness and care are completely fitting with the day off. Now, I reckon there might well be at least one or two mini legalists amongst us who will say, oh, that's what the Sabbath's for then. I've got to spend the whole of Sunday, being busy, caring, meeting the needs of the poor and the sick and the dying and all of that. I need to spend my whole day going to church and doing deeds like that and then going to church again. But again, just measure it by the heart of this command. The heart of this command is for you to have a day off. Not for you to be insanely busy doing good things for other people, but nonetheless running yourself ragged. To keep ourselves that busy goes against the command to take a day off. It's a gift, a beautiful gift of a day off. So, I wonder whether we can rejoice in God's good gift to us. A gift of a day off, a gift to relax, a gift to worship, and to not fill the day with loads of have-tos, I've got to do this, I've got to do that, or I ought to do this, I ought to do that. But to have a day we delight in, because we are delighting in God and in his good gift.